So I thought it'd be just quickly a little background on what drew me to want to study Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism in depth, and how I got to this. When I was about 16 or so, I started to feel more of a connection to something more, to a transcendent feeling to what I identified as God, a divine connection to something beyond me. And I was like, where can I find answers to that feeling or that experience? And I felt that Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, Hasidut, was the place where I could get answers to my questions of why I was feeling that, how could I connect to this experience more and more consistently, and what does it mean? And I figured if best to learn from the masters over the last couple thousand years that are experts in the soul. You know, we can go to scientists when we want to understand that subject matter, or cosmologists or mathematicians or historians. When it comes to matters of the soul, I felt, let me look in the writings of our sages, particularly our mystic sages. And, you know, through experiences in my life, a series of experiences where I started to notice more divine providence, I started to feel and sense that God wasn't detached, but was one who orchestrates everything in my life. And as I was learning more, you know, it brought more of a sense of intimacy with God, that he's not this distant being, but is someone who deeply cares and is involved in orchestrating the every situation we find ourselves in, good and bad. And even though the world seems to hide this divine existence, right? The word for world in Hebrew, olam, comes from he'elam, which means to hide, but it hides in a way that also, if you have a keen eye, reveals God's presence in the world. Kind of like a face. We look at each other's face. The face on one hand hides what's going on. You could have a stoic face, but if you pay attention, even little movements of the face can show you what's going on behind the scenes, what's going on in the person's soul. And the same goes, we believe, for the world as well. And we can learn great insights and lessons from everything that we see because of that. You know, there was a very holy rabbi, the Rebbe of Ruzhin. And the Ruzhiner Rebbe, when he was a child, someone came up to him and said, "Boy, I will give you 2 rubles if you can show me where God is." And he turned to him in a very Jewish way and he said, "And I'll give you 2 rubles if you can show me where God is not." Mm-hmm. And this idea is very fundamental to the way that Jewish mystics view reality. Ein od milvado, there is no place devoid of God. And we're going to get into what that means, not just a saying, but how that makes sense in an intellectual level as well, and how we can sense that truth. When I was a freshman at UC Santa Barbara, I spent a Shabbaton at USC, Chabad of USC. And I remember in the morning, I woke up early and there was, I walked around and downstairs, there were 2 Hasidim in the kitchen learning a book called Torah Or, from the first Rebbe of Chabad. And it ended up becoming one of my favorite books. But they were learning, it was the week of Lech Lecha. It was the week of when we learn about Abraham and Sarah. And I remember even the subject matter. When something hits you, you remember it for a long time afterwards. I can't remember stuff from 3 minutes ago, but I sometimes remember little things from very long ago. And they were talking about how the Torah we learn and the mitzvot, the commandments, the good deeds we do, are like garments for the soul. They're like sunglasses for you. Now, when you go to the next world, the next life, God's radiance, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, shines so strongly that it would be like looking at the sun. And if you look at the sun without any protection, it's not a good idea. But if you look with special sunglasses, you might be able to handle the power of the sun. And that analogy was being given of doing Torah mitzvot. Those divine commandments actually create an ability for our soul to enjoy God's presence in the next world. And the reason that I bring up this story as we transition now into some of the rules of understanding and learning Kabbalah is a crucial question that many bring up, which is, do I need to wait until I'm 40 years old to learn Kabbalah? Are there certain people that are not allowed to? Are there certain preconditions to studying this wisdom? I'm sure many of you have. How many of you have heard that question asked before about age in learning Kabbalah? All right, about half of you, right? So it does have some validity. And I think it has to do with what I just told you about Torah mitzvot being like sunglasses and the sun. A key idea of learning Kabbalah is what's called in Hebrew, mafshit min hagashmiut. Don't worry, I will translate everything throughout this course. It means to remove the physical externality of an idea. What happens is when you hear that sunglasses and the sun, we start to picture God as a bright, shiny sun, or we start to imagine all the ideas we're learning, and it's not our fault because Kabbalah uses a ton of imagery and a ton of romance, and it uses relationships as analogy. It uses relatable ideas that our minds can grasp, but they're all analogies. They're all examples to guide our minds and hearts in the right direction, but it takes a certain maturity of intellect and imagination to remove those layers further and further to get to the core. Like it says that King Solomon could tell 3,000 analogies to explain an idea. I'll probably only give you one or two, but the deeper you go, the more you start to realize and the more you learn. I learn things now that I learned 10 years ago, and now I understand it differently because my mind's kind of matured through learning over time how to look at this idea differently. So that's a huge, huge thing to keep in mind during this course, to not get stuck on it's okay to first get the outer imagery, but then to go past it. So I just want to give you like a simple exercise as an example. We're going to do some exercises during this course. And some visualizations. So I want you for a second to close your eyes. And I want you to conjure up, to think of something that you've never thought of before, that doesn't exist in our world, that you've never seen before. Just conjure up something. Okay. And now you can open your eyes. And I want you to think to yourself, was there any aspect whatsoever in what you conjured up that doesn't exist in some form? Whether it's a color, a shape, an aspect of that image, whether it's like a purple unicorn elephant or whatever we thought of, doesn't every aspect of it have to do with something you've either that exists in the world or that you've seen? Raise your hand if it does. Oh, we got one or two. Okay, almost everybody, right? And the reason for that is that human minds, our minds are limited. We are physical beings in a physical world. And the rule of physical reality, what's the rule? The rule is there's 4 dimensions. There's 3 dimensions of space, right? And there's a 4th dimension of time, but everything we know can be measured and touched. Everything we know is limited in some form. And because Kabbalah is discussing non-physical reality, we have to approach it differently. We have a secret weapon, we're lucky, right? Because we have a divine soul, we have a mind, a higher consciousness, emotions that are all latent in that soul that allow us to tap into in a reality that transcends time and space. We do have that ability, but it still has to be processed through this brain often, at least when we're learning as we are intellectually. We will have moments of meditation and transcendence and prayer where we go past that. But in this, we're trying to use which can be limited. So that's why it's important to not get stuck on the outer shell. I like to say not to look with our physical eyes, but to try to look with our mind's eye, if that resonates with you. And the more we do that, then even when we're looking at the world and at people with our physical eyes, we do it through the lens of the mind's eye. And we start to see past what's being shown to us. We train ourselves. When you meet a holy person, a tzaddik, he's removed the physicality of everything and he sees a person for who they really are. He doesn't get stuck on the outer layer. He sees the world, he sees current events, he sees politics, he sees it beyond what most people see it. He goes to the heart of the matter. And the more we do it, the more we train ourselves, the more we can do that as well. And we start to look at people in a deeper way, past what they're showing us. We start to look at the world and what's going on, zooming out a little bit and seeing beneath the surface as well. It's very important, this work that we're doing. And just to drive this idea home a little bit, I want to give you guys a few examples that come up a lot in Kabbalistic thought to show how we can start to look past the analogy. So how many of you have heard when it comes to mystical thought, describing God's energy or everything as light? Light is, I love light. I mean, light comes up. I love the term. It's non-offensive. It's not scary. I love using light for a lot of reasons. But there's a method to the madness. There's a reason why we use, when we talk about God, we call God Or Ein Sof, the infinite light. And again, if we're a novice to this study, what do we imagine in our head? A lot of light, like a lot of light, like filling up our entire minds of light everywhere. But we know, right, that it's more than that. When we're talking about God and describing God as infinite light, we mean the properties of what we know about light is what we can apply to God to a certain extent. So what are some properties of light? For example, light permeates everything. Like if the sun is shining and the clouds are not there, it's not like the light will sort of go to like part of the sky. I mean, it is shining everywhere. If you put your light in your room, your dark room is now full of light. So one aspect we're talking about when we speak about God as infinite light is that God pervades all, everywhere, omnipresent, okay? On the other hand, what's beautiful about light is that it's also, at the same time as it's everywhere, it's ethereal, right? You can't really grab it. It's not something like physical. So it's a great analogy when we're talking about God, is that God is everywhere, and yet we don't grasp the essence of who God is, even though God is everywhere. Another, and we can go on for a long time, just giving a few aspects. Another aspect of light, what we mean when we say that, is that just like the ray of the sun, the ray of the sun hits your arm, it's coming from far away. It is only a fraction of what the sun is. It is just a ray of the source, yet it still has all the properties of the source. That in that ray is what the sun is about. It's not the full power of it, but you can't remove the two. When you see the ray of the sun, you know it's connected to the source. And that's the same when we talk about God's light, as we're going to talk about during this course, and what God created and emanated, and the light that came down, 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 down until we got our world. It's still always connected back to its source. It's not disattached, and it has the properties of its source to a certain extent. Okay, so those are just a few examples of how we can hear a term, and really there's like layers to that term that's not just picturing an idea in our head. Another idea that I like, that I thought we could talk about going past the surface, is speech. So when we're reading Genesis, we open up the Torah, we open up the Chumash, we're all excited, we're at the beginning. We're going to do that in about a month from now. We see the word, we see the saying, and God said, let there be light. And God said, let there be water. And God said, let there be animals and teeming creatures. Why speech? And what does it mean if God doesn't have a mouth? How can we say God spoke, right? So these ideas of looking at things from a mystical point of view is not just, Kabbalistic books. It's even how we read basic Torah understanding. We need to have that deeper idea. So I want to ask you, what is the core function of speech? And feel free to raise your hand if you want to answer. What does speech do? What's the point? If you want to go to the essence of what speech is, how would you define the function of speech? I'm going to call on Devora. Sorry, can you unmute yourself?
Okay.
There you go.
Thanks. I think the main function of speech is connection. Communication, nice. Connection.
Communication, which is a little bit more, and which causes a connection between two. So the communication is what leads to the connection. And I guess the will to want to connect with another also leads to the communication too. So it's before, middle, it's an after. Mm-hmm. Very nice. Like it. Anyone else?
I think speech is hearing, being touched by the physical, which adds to the spiritual. It's not just words out there. It goes into our bodies, which is makes it more real to me.
I see what you're saying. So it's when God used speech to form or create, it could be just like when we speak to others, and it's more than just words. We're really connecting to the person, as Devorah said. We're really our words can, the idea of sticks and stones can break my bones, and names will never hurt me. We know how foolish that saying is. So words do create a cosmic effect, and I love that insight, actually, that it stays with you, just like God's speech, we believe, stays within the creation of the world. Anyone else?
On a basic level, it's like a self-expression, being able to manifest your ideas and thoughts into a physical way.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, that is what I'm getting to in terms of just pure functionality of what speech does, is that speech is revealing outwardly what was once hidden before in your mind and to other beings. So when the Torah says God spoke, what it really means is it's describing that creation, existence as we know it, will appear and feel to be outside of God and independent from God. Just like speech appears, once it leaves my mouth, it's gone from me. Existence will feel that it's apart from God, that it's an expression from within God that was yet within potential and now is actualized. And that's why it uses speech. There's a lot more to speech, but that's an example of how when we say God spoke, we're saying, and I'm going to get in a moment to something really cool about this idea. And also, by the way, Kabbalah explains that unlike human beings, where speech leaves us, because God is everything, the speech never left him. So all of reality is still within God, but I don't want to trip you out too far yet. Let's give it a little time. And I hope you guys for these sessions have your coffee and you're fully zoned in, because we're going to cover some deep stuff in the following sessions and really go, in depth in a short amount of time, because I'm trying to condense a lot of material. So I love it that you guys are all fully here and in the moment. That's crucial to this. The third and final example I wanted to give was the idea of other aspects of anthropomorphism, which means how the Torah likes to use physical descriptions for God. One example would be when the Torah says the might of God's hand. God used his strong and mighty hand. So Maimonides came around, and the great philosopher and Torah teacher Maimonides, Rambam, and he was a revolutionary of his time. And he said, guys, we're talking here anthropomorphically. The Torah is trying to help you understand God better, and that's why it uses human terms. Right? Famous thing, many philosophers have talked about this, that when it says God's hand, it means God's strength, God's giving to you, God's doing the things that a human hand does is what God is doing to affect us, and therefore it uses hand, but we're not talking about a hand. What I love about Jewish mystical thought is it flips this all on its head. And it says, actually, on the contrary, the Torah is not the analogy to describe God in ways that we understand. We are the analogy. The human hand is a final manifestation of what God's hand is. Everything that we think is real on earth that exists, and we're like, what's going on in those spiritual realms? Like it's all a faint glimmer of what is the real reality. Our world is simply a reflection of spiritual reality. Every aspect we see, both within us and in the world around us, evolved from the spiritual reality. So we're going to learn in week 4 about the Sfirot, the 10 emanations, divine emanations of God, the aspect of divine kindness and divine severity and discipline. Those took many gradations to become a human arm, right arm and left arm, where we give love and sometimes we hold back from giving. But the divine aspect is the blueprint. So we'll get into this more, but just 2 ways of looking at when the Torah says God's hand, neither way is what it is. It's not a physical hand, and it's definitely not only an analogy. And by the way, a really cool idea about this, how the spiritual worlds and this physical world are correlated, are connected, that means it works the other way too. Everything we do down here, everything we do in our lives here affects the cosmos. Even our positive thoughts cause an effect above. And what we do connects back up and then trickles back down here, and it's an interplay. It's an interchange that is occurring at all times. Any questions so far? Yes, Jake.
I actually don't have a question. I was saying perfect. I'm right here with you. I'm loving this. Just throwing that out there. All right, muting myself again.
I will take the good vibes and that we're all in this together. Neil, did you have something you want to add?
Do that again. That said, God's hand is not a hand, and then it's also not.
Yes. It's a lot there. There's a lot there, and honestly, it does take some time to really think of this and think to yourself about it a lot too after this. But the first explanation of saying that that God saved the Jewish people from Egypt with an outstretched hand. The philosophers and the Rambam and great rabbis said, of course God doesn't have a physical hand. It's simply explaining in human terms that God did an outward saving, like a human would use his hand to save somebody. God saved us with an outward aspect of divine energy and flow. And that's why it uses human terms. That's one level of going past what the surface layer reading. Because someone reading the Bible might be like, 1,000 years ago, God's hand. Okay, he's got a really big hand, like a human has a big hand.
I got that one. Do the second sentence.
Okay, right. Okay, great. Second level, well, no. It's not that the Torah is using the word hand so that humans can relate to it. It's that God indeed did use his hand, except the hand that we're talking about in the Torah, the divine hand, so to speak, is nothing at all like our hands. It is a template of, in this case, kindness and discipline, meaning the aspect of, honestly, this will make a lot more sense when we get to the class about the Sefirot. But what we're saying is whatever God did spiritually to cause the effect of the splitting of the sea, to cause the effect of the Jewish people taken out of Egypt and manifesting, when it says God's hand in the Torah, that's the real hand. That is the real divine energy that through many levels of creation, through angels and through worlds, as we're going to get into next week, became your hand and my hand, meaning we are this world. When you see a tree, the tree is simply a physical manifestation of something much loftier that exists. The water that we see is simply a lower manifestation of what water is in the higher worlds. And it's not physical water, it's not wet, but there's certain properties and ideas of what we see in this world that's actually rooted higher and higher and higher. So God indeed did save us with a mighty hand, but it's not a hand like we imagine it. And it's also not even talking about God's essence. We're talking about a lower manifestation of how God interacts with us. I don't want to go too deep into that now because it won't make sense. Did that help at all, just a little bit? Okay, awesome. This is just a preview. We will get into this stuff more in depth in the coming weeks. Don't worry. So I'm just going to continue a little bit with the first question that might be on our minds after going so far is, what is Kabbalah? What is Kabbalah? How do we define it? I didn't look up on Wikipedia, but this is how I want to go about it. Science discusses the what and sometimes gets into the how. Actually spends a lot of time, astrophysics especially, into the how, but a lot of it's theory. It's not proven. Judaism and Kabbalah is more focused usually on the why, right? That's why religion and science needn't conflict, really. So religion's coming to talk about the why, not the what. If you look at the Torah, it's vast. Only a few chapters are talking about creation. The rest is talking about how to live. So we're not that focused on how things came about as much in the revealed parts of the Torah. Science goes to the how, meaning it will go as far back as the Big Bang at the beginning of time. We said Judaism does the why. Kabbalah not only does the why and the what, but also goes into the how. How did reality come to be? And it actually focuses and takes off the beginning where science ends. Science will not try to postulate before the beginning. It will, now they're talking about a multiverse before the Big Bang, but for the most part, it won't go beyond anything that at least has a tinge of physicality to it, or the source of it. Kabbalah is about talking about the spiritual realms. It's about going into, how did science come about? What are the underlying axioms of reality? Like, when you want to understand what's underlying atoms in the world, science will go a little bit further within it and go further and try to have, how do the forces of nature, let's predict how they're going to interreact with each other. But honestly, science will never be able to get to the ultimate source of reality. They've been trying for many years about what's the theory of everything. How can we make all these four forces work together? But it's going to remain aloof and unfathomed. And they marvel at it. They marvel at how all of this works together. And Kabbalah reveals the source of the axioms themselves. What is the source of the way reality is? And I'm working on this, by the way. I'm friends with certain high-level astrophysicists and cosmologists, and I would love to sit down with some of these texts and see if this is the true blueprint of reality. Maybe it will give us some insight into what's going on in the world. And I do not want to get off on a tangent, but just because I want to share with you guys as much as possible, and we'll just, the most popular theory today in astrophysics is and quantum mechanics, I think might be the proper term, is string theory, that the underlying basis of everything is a vibrational force, is waves. And what I found interesting about that is, it's not fully proven at all, but it's the most popular theory, is that according to Kabbalah, all of reality is from God's speech. And even though we said God doesn't have a mouth, what we see with speech has to have certain properties that can teach us about divine speech. And what is human speech? Human speech is vibrations. Human speech is simply vibrations that comes from your throat that makes its way out, makes the sound that we hear. And if that's true above, it also makes sense, because a human is a miniature world, that would be true in the universe as well. And therefore, the fact that the entire universe could be vibrational at its core, to me, is very interesting. Could be rooted in the fact that spiritual reality is vibrational as well. So Kabbalah is continuing on in what it is. There's 4 levels of understanding Torah: Pshat, Remez, Drush, Sod. Simple understanding, the hints or the allusions, the homiletic understanding, and the secret understanding. What I mean is, when you're reading a verse in the Torah and it says, the sea split, or it says Abraham took Isaac up on the altar, there's the Pshat level, to understand it simple, point blank. We believe it's valid. We believe the stories of the Torah are as they are. However, because it's a divine document, we believe that there's deeper layers and deeper layers you can take that wisdom. And that goes for everything in Judaism. Kabbalah would be the deepest secret of the verse. And every verse you read in the Torah is really far more, and even the most boring stuff we read, and I need it, by the way, because sometimes there's some stuff about sacrifices and things. I need that deeper understanding, because it's, it brings life to the verse and you understand. There's certain Kabbalists that call the Torah the names of God. Every letter and every word is far more going on in it than just meets the eye. So that's at its core what Kabbalah is. It's going into the secret behind the verses of the Torah, and the secrets behind why we're here, and the secrets behind what reality is. And just to make it kind of simple, based on what we said earlier about how we're physical beings stuck in 4 dimensions, if space is 3-dimensional, right, up, down, right, left, front, back, all directions, and time is the 4th dimension, the 5th dimension that ties it all together is what we would call the divine reality. That aspect that Kabbalah teaches us, that divine reality is what ties it together. And I believe is the answer to what the quantum physicists are looking for. What does Kabbalah literally mean? Anybody know? Kabbalah means to receive. Like mekabel is to receive something. ideally, Kabbalah must be taught master to student. And while I may not be a master, I've learned from masters. And it's very important to do so. The entire, not just the esoteric, but the entire oral Torah, the entire Gemara and Mishnah and Torah was meant to always be teacher to student. That's why it was only written down about 2,000 years ago, the Mishnah and the Talmud and oral law. Ideally, it wasn't ever written down, and most of Kabbalah was never written down. It was only accessed by the inner group of students, and it was kept off limits for the majority of Jewish history, out of fear, I believe, that it would be misunderstood, and therefore, and even translating the Torah into a language other than Hebrew was forced upon the Jewish people. The Septuagint, the Greeks forced the rabbis to translate the Torah. But ideally, we didn't want it to ever leave its source because it's very important that it's transmitted properly. And, when Moses was up on Mount Sinai for 120 days, 40 days and 40 nights, 3 sets of times, we don't believe he was just writing down the written law and that's it. We believe he was receiving far more, the meaning behind the commandments, and not just the basic meaning, but also the esoteric meaning behind everything. And the transmission of that from Moses was something that was passed down, including the Kabbalistic wisdom, was passed down from Moses down to Joshua, then to the elders, and we actually have a tradition of how it made its way all the way down. And I can't get into every step of the journey, but I'll just mention a few highlights. We know that Rabbi Akiva, the great Rabbi Akiva, and his disciple, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who authored the Zohar. Some say Rabbi Akiva authored the Sefer Yetzirah, and also the Bahir, another fundamental book, was written, Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, who was also at that time period. So about 2,000 years ago, around the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, was when the foundational aspects of Kabbalah were written down, were actually saved. And there's a lot of discussion about when, people believe the Zohar and all these books were published later, but I've studied a lot historically about why we root it to that time and those rabbis from 2,000 years ago. And that was a crucial fundamental time period. And the famous Zohar, probably the most famous Kabbalistic book, is from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai from that time period. It quotes him throughout. And so a lot of it was drawn down from Moshe, but it was also perceived by them. Some rabbis were able to access higher realities. They also learned from Elijah the prophet, we believe, Eliyahu Hanavi. And I'm going to skip about 1,400 years, 1,400 years to, I'll mention one before we get 1,400 years. In the medieval time, there was also Rabbi Avram Abulafia and Rabbi Yosef Gikatzilia and a few others that really started to share the meditative aspects of Kabbalah, as I'll explain in a moment. But the real big kind of revolution came in Tzfat. How many of you have been to Tzfat in northern Israel? All right, whoever hasn't, we got to take you there. We got to do a field trip at the end of our Kabbalah Masterclass group and go to the grave sites and the synagogues of all these sages we're learning about. It really brings it to life. And the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, he only lived 38 years, and he moved to Tzfat only for 2 years, from age 36 to 38 before he passed away. But in those 2 years, he was able to revolutionize Kabbalistic thought. And he was someone who, his biography is very inspiring. This is the life of the Arizal. I try to get books on all these sages to learn about them too, because learning about a person's life can also bring out a lot, not just his teachings. The Arizal spent 7 years on the River Nile in Egypt meditating and studying the Zohar. He would read a verse and meditate on the verse sometimes for a week. That's called real dedication. And by the way, he said he reached his lofty levels through the joy he had in doing a mitzvah. We don't know where our enlightenment can come from. Sometimes from simple things. And the Arizal really kind of explained what had been locked away. The Zohar was very hard for many to understand what it meant. And the Arizal really systematized the entire thing through his student, Rabbi Chaim Vital. And he really is really and it's not easy. I mean, I don't delve that much yet into his writings. I more learn from the rabbis who take those ideas and bring them down. But a lot of what we'll learn will be based on things that the Arizal really elucidated and really finally explained what the Zohar meant. So we have him to thank for a lot of this course. That's the history of the drawing it down. And thank God I've had the opportunity to learn from brilliant rabbis who learned from their rabbis, who learned from their rabbis, back to these great sages. So there's an unbroken chain. And what I want to do now is I want to break down the 4 aspects of Kabbalah, of really the 4 different ways and aspects to it. So the first aspect of Kabbalah is what we would call theoretical, or the philosophy of it. That's what we're going to spend most of our time on. It's what most students spend their time on. This is began with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, as we mentioned, and the Arizal explained, and his contemporaries. And this is really kind of the science of the spiritual realms. How did we get here? How did we get from an infinite being to a finite table and books and people? How did that happen? And we're going to discuss next week what's called Seder Hishtalshalut, which means the downchaining of worlds, how we got here, and the purpose of why we're here, what we're meant to be doing. That's the first aspect that we spend most of our time on. Another aspect of Kabbalah is called meditative Kabbalah. That's the medieval period, that is a lot of focus on how can we meditate and utilize the Hebrew letters and names of God to reach higher states. It's a bit dangerous. A lot of the mystics they warned against using divine names. As you know, in Judaism, we don't even say God's ineffable name. We use another name of God when we say the 4-letter name of God. We pronounce it differently. There's a reason for that. Every name of God has a different flow of energy and a different reason why we use that name. But there were certain mystics that knew how to reach higher realms through meditating on certain names of God and angels. The third aspect is even more kind of off limits, or is not really, we don't really involve ourselves with much. And that's what I would call practical Kabbalah, meaning using it in life. So there's stories of the Maharal of Prague. Anybody been to Prague in the Czech Republic? So Maharal supposedly, because of the anti-Semitism of his area, through using Hebrew letters and names of God, he was able to create a golem, create a living being that protected his area. And there's stories in the Talmud that start to make more sense once you realize that, because it says many of the Amoraim in the Talmud would create animals to eat on Shabbat. Sorry, they weren't vegan, but we'll work on that. They would actually be able to create things from nothing and give life. So I had once I met. Actually, you know what? I'll leave that for another time. Unfortunately, some of the greatest mystics tried to go really far with this, and there's stories of like Yosef de Lorena, who tried to bring down angels and force them to reveal mysteries to him, so he could force the redemption. He could force the bring of Mashiach. I actually found a book where I read the whole account of it, and it's one of the most kind of disturbing, shocking things I've read of but he got close. He got close to vanquishing kind of darkness and creating this, but it's not meant to be. It's not something we're supposed to force upon reality. And there's a lot of cool stories and interesting history regarding this. And lastly is what I would call personal Kabbalah, which we're also going to use a lot of. And that would be Chassidut. That would be the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov in the 1700s. He taught and passed down through Chabad and Breslov and many learnings that we don't just need to focus on Kabbalah and focus on heaven and detach ourselves from this world and learn about the heavenly realms. The goal is to bring heaven down to earth. How can I see God and connect to him with everything I do, with my physical material life, my day-to-day life? How can I see this tree and see this bird and see it as divine expressions? And it definitely uses Kabbalah, no question, but it's unique. It goes almost beyond Kabbalah does. And I would say it's the highest level, because you could almost look at Kabbalah as being divine and spiritual, and this world is physical, Chassidut came to explain, how do we merge the two? And the only way you can merge two opposites is to go higher than both. When you go to the essence of who God is not limited to spiritual and is not limited to physical either. Infinite can bridge even things that are so apart as spiritual and physical. There's a beautiful analogy my rabbi gave me. Is he said there was once a maiden, a woman who was meant to marry somebody, but he disappeared. And she cried and cried and cried and wrote letters. And so he sent her a diary of all of his like personal feelings. And that wasn't enough for her. She was still feeling the lack. So he agreed to send like a picture of himself or a picture of himself, of his anatomy, of who he was. And that wasn't enough. She still wanted him. And the analogy is the diary of this person is like the Torah. God's instructions, deepest ideas he gives us through the Torah. However, we want more than that. And the mystical secrets, the Kabbalah, is almost the picture of God, so to speak. It is who God is and how God expresses self and goes into really who God is, not just verses to understand what God wants from us, but actually understanding God. And then Chassidut came around and said, that's not enough. We want God. Ana Nasiv Malka, I want the king. The Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad movement, was known to call out and scream out when he prayed on his own. And he said, in Yiddish, he said, I don't want your Olam Haba. I don't want your Gan Eden. Ich will dir allein. He said, I don't want your paradise. I don't want your world to come. I don't want all the spiritual bounty. I just want you alone. And Chassidut really goes to the essence of wanting to connect to who God is beyond even these manifestations we're all going to learn about through this course. And we're actually going to get into that in the final session. So don't miss the final 5th week. Okay, you guys have been troopers. We're almost there. We're getting to the rest of the picture. I wanted to discuss for a second preparation and really getting the most out of your study of this wisdom. It's known that, first of all, we have to understand the context. Kabbalah did not sprout out of anywhere. I'm sure we've all heard of the Kabbalah Center in LA and celebrity Madonna, and many that I meet are interested in it, in learning Kabbalah and mystical studies, but like not the rest of Judaism, not the practice or any responsibilities or we have to understand that Kabbalah didn't sprout out of nowhere. It was not its own wisdom that came out of a well. It is part of the Torah tradition. It is part of the Torah tradition. Right before the Arizal took over, the leading mystic of his time, who was also massively instrumental in the growth, was the Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero. If you go to Tzfat, he's buried right next to the Arizal. And he likens studying Kabbalah without studying the rest of Judaism, without studying halacha, Jewish law, any of it. He likens that to trying to gaze at stars without noticing the potholes in front of your feet. You're going to fall, right? He says that in Or Nerav, chapter 1, section 6. Rabbi Chaim Vital, who's the student of the Arizal and wrote all of his works, he says that learning Kabbalah without learning the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, or the Mishnah, or the rest of Torah, is like a soul without a body. So he says we have to study this wisdom. We have to, but first we have to purify the body so that it can receive the soul best. And that is done through the mitzvot. That's the intro to the Arizal's writings from Rabbi Chaim Vital. I'm just sharing with you what these foremost mystics had to say about the matter. I once heard the analogy of trying to enjoy a flower by pulling it out from the soil. You're going to enjoy it for a bit, but it's going to die out. It needs to be planted in the soil. The kind of the vessel to receive the light of Kabbalah best is to purify that vessel. So to give you an example, there's an anonymous book written in the 14th century from it's called Masechet Atzilut, and he begins with this line, and it's from Psalms 25, and it says, "Sod Hashem lire'av ubrito le'olam," which means The secret of God is for those who fear him, which means, I don't like the word fear. Yirah means having awe for. Having awe for the divine is foundational for the study to lead us to the next level. Without that, just learning it as like a fun thing, or learning it without the desire to grow and connect and go further, it won't take us there. It's important that Kabbalah has that preparation. And I know people that go on they go to Peru to do psychedelic ayahuasca experiences or anything like that. They'll tell you right away. They're trying to go to this next dimension. They're going to any type of life-altering experience. They are going to clean out their diet. They are going to clean out their mind. They're going to clear out the static and make a vessel to receive all this light. If we're full of junk, if we have a lot going on, I'm not saying don't enjoy some Netflix during this course, but if we have so much coming at us, it's and no quiet and no ability to reflect and to refine ourselves through the practical stuff, through being a good person, through cultivating character traits like patience. If I'm yelling at everybody around me 2 minutes before I start the class, and we're all guilty of that, I'm not this is for all of us, we can't, it's part and parcel. And that doesn't mean we have to be perfect in order to study it either, because it works in tandem. By learning it, that will refine us. And when we refine ourselves, we will learn better. So it works together. But I would just say to learn it on its own and not to change ourselves and to become better. And there's a book called Shari Kedusha over here. This is Rabbi Chaim Vital Shari Kedusha. He has a whole chapter on this, of all the different prerequisites to learning Kabbalah, how we have to work on our patience and our anger and what we look at and how we treat others and how we eat and how we observe the mitzvot. And all of that is kind of the foundational point to really integrate this holy wisdom into our lives. One more thing I would just say is that our will and our intention is huge as well. Like if we have a will to get better, if we have a desire to learn more and to try, that is the kind of the real foundation. That is where it's at. By learning these ideas, we attach ourselves to those teaching it, and it raises us up. At the beginning of Rabbi Chaim Vital, the Arizal's book, he says, he has a little prayer, and it says, "May I attach myself to the soul of the writer." It's actually part of this intellectual exercise of learning his book, is like attaching yourself. We believe when you learn someone's work, they've placed their essence into that work, and you're really connecting to that person. So we're going to get into the actual texts during this course as well. We're going to read in the text, and we can think to ourselves how we're connecting back. And it's a beautiful idea, by the way. If you're ever reading Psalms of King David in Hebrew or English, if you're not feeling excited by it, just imagine as you're saying the words, imagine King David saying those words. He's running for his life. He's got enemies all around him. He's calling out to God for help. It's not a theoretical situation. It's a real prayer. It's a real, and we know he had divine intuition with what he wrote. And he's in the middle of the desert of Israel pouring out these words. And when you say the words, imagine King David saying it at the same time, because he is, and because this is what he was saying. So really we shouldn't look at this material as ancient and not connected to us today. And I just want to say why learning this is so important. Not just can we, or should we? Why is this vital? Many were against sharing it. And I heard an analogy of Reb Aaron Strauscheller. He said that imagine a king placing a lot of walls around his palace and around all his sacred jewels and wealth and all of his precious stuff. What if nobody's interested? In our time, the Kabbalah throughout history was hidden because many were trying to go too far I think in our generation, it's a time where most people aren't even searching for transcendence or we're not trying to go too far. We need this wisdom to bring us up to a higher place. So if in the times of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he said to keep it secret, even the Arizal 500 years ago said it's a mitzvah to learn it now. And it's not to take away from the past that it should have been kept to a select few that were worthy, so to speak. But in our generation, it's almost what we call in Hebrew sakanot nefashot. It's life or death that we need it spiritually. And just to leave you with one story on that, the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, one time he was walking with Rabbi Pinchas of Koretz, and Rabbi Pinchas was against the sharing of Hasidic teachings with simple people, so to speak, or with the masses, as he called it. And the Alter Rebbe was for it. And they had an argument, whatever, it was a standing argument. And one day they're walking and they see a paper from their master, the Maggid of Mezrich. They see a paper of his teachings in the gutter. You know, somebody had been learning it and it flew away. And this incensed Rabbi Pinchas. So he knew the preciousness of these teachings. And he was like beside himself. So the Alter Rebbe turned to him and he told him a story. And he said, one time there was a king who had a son, the prince, who became deathly ill. And the king called every physician he possibly could find to find a cure for his son. And nobody could do it. And the kid was getting worse and worse and worse. Finally, one of his advisors said, I know a possible solution, but I don't think you're going to want to do it. So the king said, what do you mean? For my son, I'll do anything. He said, you're going to have to take the jewel, the crown jewel in the center of your crown, the one you love so much, and you're going to have to grind it up into a medicine, grind it up into powder. I'm going to mix that with water, and we're going to drink for your son. And not only that, but most of it, the way his mouth is so closed, it's all going to fall out. But maybe a drop will come in and heal him. Maybe. And when the Alter Rebbe told that analogy to Rabbi Pinchas was placated. He said, you've spoken well. And the idea is that these mystical teachings are the crown jewel of God. These are the deepest, closest things to God's will. But because our generation is feeling deathly ill spiritually, we feel disconnected. We've gone through the Holocaust. We've gone through assimilation. We've gone through everything possible. We're not feeling so connected. We have so many other things taking up our space. The mystics believe that it's needed in our time to lift us up, to bring us back to life, to give us vitality in our Jewish lives and in our Judaism. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, thousands of years ago, he hinted that in the Messianic times, children will be learning these secrets. Page 118a of Zohar says children will be learning these secrets one day. And, you know, like imagine a wedding. If you come early to the wedding, then you eat everything in order. You have the salad, the soup, then you get the fish, then you get the main course, then the dessert. I've been a student in yeshiva. When you come late to a wedding, you just grab what there is. You know, okay, there's a little bit of buffet left, a little dessert here, a little meat there. As we get closer to the redemption and the end of times, we believe there's a time where you can maybe, even if you're not proficient in every Jewish law and every verse there is, it's okay to skip ahead. It's okay to take for whatever excites you in your Jewish connection, in your spiritual connection. Doesn't mean to only have dessert, because then we get a little bit sick. We want to have a healthy, balanced diet. But it's okay to jump ahead a little bit. And just to wrap up what we've been saying, Kabbalah and Chassidut teach us the wisdom of how we got here, what this world is, why we're here, kind of like Matt Damon in the Bourne trilogy, where he like wakes up and he's trying to remember like, how did he get here? What's going on? So that's what this helps us do. It explains like, oh, that's why I'm here. It adds vitality and energy in our service of God. Simply thinking the ideas transports us to higher realms. The Baal Shem Tov teaches that you are where your mind is. So if your mind is fixated on depressing things, if your mind is fixated on elevated things, you are in that place. Two people can be sitting next to each other, and one can be in heaven and one can be in hell, and they're sitting on the same couch. It's a matter of where you are in your mindset. And learning these ideas and walking down the street while you're thinking of these ideas elevates you very high. So it's good to be thinking after these classes about them and wondering. And ultimately it's a mitzvah. The Torah itself says, "V'yadata yom b'shlosavecha ki Hashem Elokeim b'shamayim ma'al v'aretz enod," that you must know God. When we say Shema, God is one, what do we think about? Are you thinking God is one and not two or three? That's not the point. The point is to actually understand how God is truly one. And of course, you might say the famous line from the sages, Im yadati v'yitiv, if I knew God, I would be God. You can't know God. That's not possible. An infinite being, that's ridiculous with a finite brain. But right? I mean, if God formed grass and he formed water, he also formed intellect. So, we're trying to understand everything in life, and we're like, how come I don't get everything? That's because what God's doing, an infinite being, your mind is created too. It's limited. However, Hasidut reads that line, if I knew God, I would be God, literally. If I could know God, I would be connected to God. I'll be one with God. If I can know these secrets, if I can understand more what was revealed in the later stages of history through these incredibly divinely connected sages, then I can be that drop that goes back in the ocean. I can be that flame going back in the bonfire. I can reconnect and be absorbed back into the light. And it's crucial, because if we want to believe in a God, it's nice to believe in a God in theory, but if our belief is that God's really big, like a child, God's bigger than the world. No, that's not enough. We want to understand all the levels of reality so then we can appreciate what it means that God is big, God is great. We can actually have a substance to that and a color to that and a real feel for what that means. And it just adds so much. Imagine a child saying space is really impressive or large. I guarantee you the cosmologist feels that much more awe, because he actually understands what that means, how vast it truly is. It adds so much more to that experience. We will become more attuned and aware of a higher divine reality through this course. We will learn how to elevate our surroundings. We will learn how to elevate and refine ourselves. And just don't get overwhelmed, is all I would say. Whenever you're embarking on a new study, the vastness and depth of it can seem daunting and overwhelming. And if we had years, there's a story of the Arizal that he was talking in his sleep, and one of his students put his ear to listen, and he woke up with a start. And the student said, sorry, teacher, but do you mind telling me what you were just learning now in the heavenly realms? Because that's what he would do. And he said, I promise you, if we had 80 years together right now, I couldn't explain to you the depth of what I just learned. Now, that can seem overwhelming and daunting. On the other hand, there's an idea that one idea that you really connect with, just one, not 1,000, one idea can change your life. Just one. There's a beautiful teaching that to purify yourself in Judaism, there's an idea of going into a mikveh, a body of water. And there's a halachic question, philosophical question, that a mikveh has to have a certain amount of water in it. To be kosher. But the question was, what if you could take like one drop of water and completely cover a person with that? And they said, yes, that would work. And one of my teachers said the same goes with these ideas that are likened to water, mystical Torah. If you can immerse yourself completely in even one idea, it will fully purify you, it will fully inspire you. So if you're listening to a bunch of ideas, but one really connects with you and one grasps hold, then do that. Then really connect with the idea. It's not only about quantity, it's also about the quality of it. And honestly, this course is more about creating the skeleton of Kabbalah, the Kabbalah 101, the framework of everything that we can begin working from and building the body around it. But I like to just cover a lot and give you a breadth of knowledge to give you that foundation. Also, one last thing that I love to incorporate in my classes is experiential Judaism element. So we will definitely be having meditation involved. We will definitely be having ways to fully, the King David says in Psalm 34, Tamu re'u ki tov Hashem, taste and see that God is good. And the word for taste in Hebrew, tam, is the same as the word for reasoning. Tam is when you understand something, it gives you taste, it gives you pleasure in that thing, but also means it's not enough to understand intellectually. We have to taste it. We have to fully enjoy it. I can tell you how good chocolate is. I can tell you how good challah is. I can tell you how good chocolate challah is, but until you taste it, you won't fully understand. And Judaism never wants to be left just in the intellectual sphere. We want to sense it and experience it. So in this course, we're going to do our best to taste the divine sweetness within reality. And I'll just close off with a story that I was thinking about recently. Is the Maggid of Mezrich, the teacher, the student of the Baal Shem Tov, who really spread Hasidic thought. He used to pray at length, and he would pray with the intentions of the Arizal, and it would take him a long time. And one time, another man was praying near him, and he also prayed with the same intentions of the Arizal, but he finished in like a third of the time. So he waited politely, and when the Maggid finished, he said, I don't understand why it takes you so much longer than me. I also pray with these divine intentions of the higher worlds, but it doesn't take me so long. So the Maggid kind of changed topics, and he said, what do you do for a living? So he said, look, once a year I go to the big town of Leipzig, and I buy merchandise, and I come back to my village far away, and I sell it and make a profit. So the Maggid said, I don't understand. Why don't you just have intention in your mind of going there and buying the material, coming back, and then selling it? Wouldn't that save you a lot of time? So he laughed. He said, it's ridiculous. I can't just intend it. I have to go there and buy it and do it. So the Maggid said, so too with my prayers. And what he was saying was that the next level is not just to think about these ideas, but it's to be there. He was there. He wasn't just intending the lofty realms. He was fully, and by the way, that other guy is pretty lofty too. He studied all those ideas, and he actually intended those ideas and those intentions. The Maggid actually put himself there. He was present in the moment, and he experienced it. He put himself and his mind and his heart and his whole being into that reality. And he was there. And that took a lot longer because he was doing the work. He wasn't just having it in mind. So Jewish mysticism, Judaism, is meant to be experienced and felt and not only thought of. Thinking of it as the first step. That's it. You guys were very patient, and I wanted to give you a brief overview, and I also, just to know what's coming up, so you guys have a little bit of knowledge of what's coming up. The first week, next week, what we're going to get into is we're going to get into the spiritual framework of reality, the chain of creation, how we got from an infinite until us, all the steps to get there. So we're going to condense infinite amount of time in one session. In the week after, we're going to talk about a major event that happened along that chain called the world of chaos, the breaking, shattering of vessels, which leads us to what our purpose is in this world. How do we rectify what happened in that chain? Then we're going to talk about the week after about the 10 sefirot, about the divine traits that make up the heavenly worlds and that make up your psyche and my psyche and make up who we are. And in the final session, we're going to wrap it all together and talk about Dira B'Tachtonim, a dwelling place in this world. How is the physical world really the ultimate level in the whole chain of reality, where you would think it's the lowest, it's really the highest? So every class will include some authentic text, as I mentioned. Every class will include an experiential element. And every class will be practical. We will present these ideas in a way that we can translate into our daily lives, into our relationships, into our families, into our own inner world. As I mentioned, we'll have time for a Q&A session at the end of every session. And if we need during as well, I'll be available for correspondence. And if we want to join our community together in other ways, let's do that. It would be great during the week to connect on Facebook, like I mentioned, and other places.